This year, 2026, marks 40 years since the publication of John Byrne's Man of Steel miniseries, which relaunched the character of Superman, introducing what we call the post-crisis version of the character. Crisis referring to Crisis on Infinite Earths, the 12-issue limited series that resulted in the entire DC universe being rebooted. The Man of Steel miniseries is definitely worth a video in this series, and I'm going to do one a bit later this year. But for now, I wanted to talk about an earlier attempt to relaunch Superman, one that began 15 years before Byrne's Man of Steel. This one was more of a soft reboot. DC Comics had not yet disappeared up its own ass, constantly resetting its fictional universe and obsessively tinkering with its canon. And unlike the post-crisis Superman, it didn't last very long. It was an attempt to revamp Superman for what was then the modern era, the early 1970s. And it was the product of some of the most well-known and important creators in the history of the company: editor Julius Schwartz, writer Denny O'Neil, and artist Curt Swan. It's commonly referred to today as the Sandman Saga. It's also been collected under the title Kryptonite Nevermore. Whatever you call it, it begins with the January 1971 issue of Superman, number 233. As the story begins, a scientist is testing an experimental new energy source called the Kryptonite Engine. There isn't much detail offered as to how the Kryptonite engine works, but I'm guessing it's pretty much what it sounds like. An engine that runs on kryptonite, which, if you think about it, is a genius idea that I'm surprised nobody thought of before this. In this era of the DC universe, there was more kryptonite than anybody knew what to do with. They were probably selling chunks of it in souvenir shops at national parks, which would explain Clark Kent's outspoken insistence that Yosemite was not even that impressive. Like, really, Clark? Anyway, the Kryptonite engine goes dangerously haywire a few moments after it is activated for the first time, and Superman flies in with a big lead shield he fabricated for just this eventuality. But the engine explodes before Supes can get the lead shield in place, and he is violently thrown back into the sand surrounding the complex. Incredibly, Superman is unharmed by what should have been a massive exposure to deadly kryptonite radiation. He stands up, leaving a very conspicuous Superman-shaped print in the sand, and discovers something extraordinary. Another scientist runs up with a chunk of kryptonite, only the kryptonite has been turned to iron. Then someone else approaches with an armful of kryptonite from their vault. All of it has been turned to iron as well. That's not all. Superman soon confirms that the effect goes far beyond the Kryptonite engine site. Somehow, the explosion of the Kryptonite engine caused a global chain reaction, and all kryptonite on Earth has been transformed into iron. Superman's most obvious weakness, the greatest threat to his life, is gone. So that would be a positive change in Superman's life. However, this issue introduces some negative developments as well. First, there's the new owner of the Daily Planet, Morgan Edge, who informs Clark Kent that he's now a TV reporter for WGBS, which Edge also owns. Clark isn't fond of the idea of becoming a TV personality. He worries that it will make slipping away to change into Superman more complicated. For his first assignment, Edge dispatches Clark to cover the launch of a new mail rocket, which, much like the Kryptonite engine, is exactly what it sounds like: a rocket which will be used to deliver the mail. While doing his live shot from the launch site, Clark notices a suspicious character lurking nearby. Fortunately, Morgan Edge is such a cheapskate, he didn't send a full remote TV crew to do this story, only Clark with a portable camera/transmitter combo. You know, one of those TV cameras with a transmitter built in that's small enough to carry with you over your shoulder. From 1971? Anyway, because it's just Clark there, he's able to make his live report to the TV station, then throw to a commercial and do a quick change into Superman to go see about that suspicious guy. It turns out some crooks are planning to steal the mail rocket. Well, obviously, what criminal organization wouldn't want a rocket that delivers the mail? The plan is to wait for the rocket to take off and then intercept it with a pair of airplanes. Points to the crooks for audacity. That's gotta be the most difficult method for stealing a rocket. Superman prevents the crooks from stealing the mail rocket, though something unusual happens when he's in the air. His heat vision fails him at one point. Then, as he and the airplanes fly over the site of the Kryptonite engine explosion, with that Superman print still visible in the sand, Superman starts to feel weak. It subsides once he passes over the explosion site. At the conclusion of this issue, we see a figure form within that imprint left by Superman in the sand. It stands, a copy of Superman made from the Earth, shaped by the mold of that imprint, and staggers off toward the horizon. The next several issues continue to follow three main threads. Superman struggling to keep up his heroics while his powers fluctuate, Superman's duplicate, I'll call him Sandy Superman to avoid any confusion, following him around and growing more powerful, and Clark Kent adjusting to now being a TV reporter instead of a newspaper reporter. In Superman 234, Supes tries and fails to stop a volcanic eruption on a Pacific island, eventually settling for relocating a rainstorm to delay the eruption long enough for the island to be evacuated. In the issue after that, he fights a new villain, Pan, a disgruntled museum curator who uses a cursed harp to steal abilities from others, including, temporarily, Superman's powers. In the issue after that, Superman number 236, we take a break from the ongoing adventures of Superman and Sandy Superman for a story about Supes finding himself in what at first appears to be the Christian afterlife, then turns out to be a planet where telepathic alien criminals have attempted to trick Superman into helping them by making him think he has died. Let's pause there. You might recall how a few minutes ago I told you that this soft reboot of Superman was an attempt to modernize the character, to get away from what was thought of as the childishness and silliness of the Silver Age and fashion a more serious take similar to what Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams had done with Batman. So this issue is about Superman being tricked by telepathic aliens into thinking he has died and gone to heaven, and some angels give Superman a special mission to descend into hell and open a gate to prove his worthiness to enter God's kingdom. And Superman turns to the chief angel, Gabriel, naturally, and says, "Sure thing," and flies into hell, which is conveniently right there. How else are the redeemed supposed to observe and enjoy the torments of the damned? And is about to force open that gate Gabriel mentioned when he sees demonic apparitions of Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Batman in the hellish flames, and he starts to think, hey, there's something a little strange about all of this. So, instead of breaking open the gate like the angels told him to, Superman tunnels under it and pops up on the other side. Not unexpectedly, he finds a bunch of red devil-looking guys wielding pitchforks. He fights them for a bit, but stops as he faces the fact that this whole thing just doesn't seem very, spiritual. If this is the afterlife, why was there soot on Gabriel's robe? Why did Superman just have to dig through dirt to get to this side of the gate? Why did he see Lois, Jimmy, and Batman? Sure, they're all going to hell eventually, but they shouldn't be there yet. The chief devil, he isn't given a name, which just shows you how biased Denny O'Neil was against people in hell, says to Superman, "Oh shit, you're starting to see through the illusion. Those angels aren't really angels, and we aren't really devils. Concentrate, and I'll help you to see me as I truly am." And as Superman concentrates, the devil transforms into a uniformed alien dude. "Now you see me as I truly am," the alien says. "A law officer from the planet Beta U." Oh shit, so they're not devils, it's even worse. They're cops. The alien cops explain that the angels Superman encountered are actually dangerous criminals, and these cops have been chasing them across the galaxy. The angels lured the cops to this rogue planet wandering at the edge of the solar system and damaged the engine of their ship. So the cops hid themselves behind a protective wall of nuclear fire, as you do. The angels reached out telepathically for someone capable of getting past the nuclear fire, and they found Superman on Earth, the nearest inhabited planet, and fashioned this illusion from his mind to convince him to help them. Superman flies through the gate, beats up two of the angels, but Gabriel escapes and heads for Earth with a bomb small enough for him to carry in his hands, but apparently powerful enough to blow up the entire planet Earth. And they couldn't figure out how to open that fucking gate? Superman detonates the planet-killing bomb before it reaches Earth, knocks out Gabriel, and turns him over to the alien cops. "One last question," he says to the chief cop. "When I broke the telepathic spell, you guys stopped looking like devils, but the bad guys still look like angels. What's up with that?" And the chief is like, "Oh, that's how they actually look." Makes you think, huh? Bye. What was the editorial meeting for this issue like? Did Denny O'Neil come into Julie Schwartz's office and say, "Okay, I know we're trying to pivot away from the Silver Age tone, but I've got one goofy one, please? Some of it ostensibly takes place in hell. If that helps, does that help? Is that mature and modern enough?" Sandy Soups returns in the following issue, which sees Superman confronting a contagious disease brought to Earth by an unfortunate astronaut. The disease causes humans to mutate into lumpy green monsters, and Superman himself is the carrier. At one point, Superman confronts Sandy Soups on the roof and is about to touch him when a powerful repulsive force throws him back. Superman later realizes that the force from almost touching his duplicate somehow disinfected his hand. So he meets Sandy Soups again, this time in space, and tries to give him a hug. Again, they don't quite touch, but there is an explosion that sends Superman hurtling back to Earth, completely cleansed of the lumpy green monster germs. Superman is just in time to save Lois from some South American bandits and an oncoming horde of killer ants, but his powers are weaker than ever. He can't fly, bullets still bounce off his chest, but he can feel them now, and his super strength is diminished. Meanwhile, Sandy Soups is getting stronger and more colorful with each close encounter with the real Superman. At the end of the issue, Sandy Soups, who has also gained the ability to speak, tells Superman that he will recover his powers eventually, but when that happens, he and Sandy Soups will be equals, and when they finally do battle against each other, they may not both survive. In the next issue, pirates hijack Project Magma, an experimental attempt to cultivate a new source of energy by tapping the heat from the molten rock beneath the Earth's surface. I think if we've learned nothing else from this storyline so far, it's that finding sources of energy other than fossil fuels is both necessary and incredibly dangerous to Superman. Still operating at a fraction of his usual power level, Superman asks Sandy Soups for help against the pirates, but Sandy Soups is like, "Hey, fuck off, man. That's a humanity problem. I'm made of sand. I don't give a shit." Even without the assistance of Sandy Soups, Superman, in his diminished state, is able to defeat the pirates. He even regains his ability to fly just in time to dive down a shaft and catch a bomb before it can explode and split the Earth in half. What is with this storyline and bombs powerful enough to blow up the entire planet, yet small enough for one person to carry? Was that a very specific form of nuclear paranoia common in the early 1970s? Superman number 239 is a giant-sized special reprinting several stories from the late 50s and early 60s, which is cool, and a nice way to expose readers of the early 70s to some Silver Age goodness they may have missed the first time around, but like the Superman Goes to Hell story a couple of issues back, is also a confusing editorial decision given that they were in the middle of an attempt to modernize the character and turn away from the Silver Age. Beginning with issue number 240, the focus shifts away from the mostly standalone adventures we've been getting to center directly on Superman's conflict with his dirtful doppelganger. Things start to go downhill fast for Superman when he is unable to stop a building from collapsing after a fire. He is able to get everyone safely out of the building, but he isn't strong enough to keep it standing. Superman has kept his weakened powers a secret, and this is the first time he has publicly failed. The people of Metropolis turn on Superman immediately, openly mocking him when they see him walking down the street. A construction worker yells, "Hey, be careful no buildings fall on ya!" This is the most realistic detail in the entire storyline, I think. People suck, and it is absolutely believable that after saving the world more times than anyone can count, Superman would fuck up one time and everyone would immediately decide that he's a loser. Superman is bitter over the public's instantaneous loss of faith in him, but he only mopes for about a page before duty calls and he pulls himself together and springs into action, thwarting a bank robbery attempt by a gang using firepower you'd only see from the military in the 1970s or the police department of a mid-sized American city in the 2020s. Supes is able to catch most of the gang, but the ringleaders escape. Back in his office at WGBS, Clark Kent finds I-Ching waiting for him. Who is I-Ching? Okay, so during this period, Denny O'Neil was the go-to guy for retooling and modernizing DC Comics characters. He'd played a major role in bringing a more serious tone to Batman, and he'd also revamped the character of Wonder Woman beginning in the late 60s. During O'Neill's run as writer of the book, Wonder Woman gave up her superpowers and continued crime fighting by becoming a martial artist. Her instructor and mentor was I-Ching, a blind monk whose mastery of the martial and mystical arts made him a formidable warrior. So that's who I-Ching is. And he's visiting Clark because his uncanny perception has told him that Clark Kent is Superman and that he needs help regaining his full superpowers. That night at I-Ching's place, I-Ching is in the middle of a psychic ritual intended to restore Superman's powers when they're interrupted by the three ringleaders of that bank robbery from earlier, who have figured out that Superman is weak and have come to finish him off. One of them smacks Superman in the head with his pistol, leaving a big old knot on Superman's head. Superman wakes up, and even though his superpowers are almost gone, he's able to take out all three crooks. As the next issue begins, Superman and I-Ching pick up where they left off, and I-Ching is able to complete his psychic ritual, which separates Superman's soul from his body and sends it off to reclaim his lost superpowers. Superman's soul does this by finding Sandy Superman, who is just standing alone in an empty band shell at night like a weirdo, and draining away his superpowers. Superman's soul returns to his body, Superman wakes up, and he's super again. It worked! Except something's wrong. Physically, Superman is back to full strength, but mentally, he seems a little off. He goes way overboard when apprehending a mugger, building a custom jail cell around the guy at super speed as he flees. He asks some army guys to shoot him with artillery so he can test his invulnerability, and afterwards says to them, "It must have been quite a privilege for you to shoot at me like that. If you're testing H-bombs anytime soon, let me know." He catches a driver speeding and picks up the car and drops it on the roof of a skyscraper and just leaves it there. Concerned, I-Ching meets with Superman and says, "I'm afraid you might be suffering from brain damage caused by the blow to the head you took from those crooks at my place the other night. And since I restored your superpowers after you suffered that injury, I'm afraid it might be permanent." Superman's like, "Brain damage, sprain, spramage. There's not a thing wrong with me. I'm spreeling sprine." And he flies away to, I don't know, fling a truant child into the sun. I-Ching, accompanied by Wonder Woman, finds the ailing form of Sandy Superman in the park where Superman's soul left him after draining his powers. Sandy Supes explains what his deal is, and I-Ching says, "Oh, you're a being from the realm of Quarm. It's a dimension inhabited by creatures without physical form. When they enter into our world, they usually assume the form of the first thing they come into contact with. The explosion of the Kryptonite engine that started all of this must have opened a rift into the realm of Quarm, and that's where you, Sandy Superman, came from." Sandy Superman's like, "Yeah, I guess." I-Ching formulates a plan. Because Sandy Superman drains Superman's powers every time they get close to each other, they just need to get Supes and Sandy Supes together so that Sandy Supes can weaken Superman enough for a doctor to crack open his skull and fix his brain. It's a good plan. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to anyone but us in the audience, Sandy Supes has accidentally torn open another rift between our world and the realm of Quarm, and the formless being that comes through inhabits a papier-mâché statue of a war demon being carried in a parade in Chinatown, transforming the statue into an actual war demon that begins rampaging through the city. Sandy Supes does successfully drain Superman's power again, but then Superman is attacked by the War Demon, as well as a couple of thugs who team up to knock Superman out. After the War Demon and the thugs leave the scene, Jimmy Olsen shows up and calls an ambulance for Superman. At the hospital, the doctor tells Jimmy that Superman is vulnerable enough for them to operate and repair his brain injury. Jimmy says, "Do it, Doc, and don't worry about the cost. I'll raise whatever money you need." The American healthcare system. A nightmare then, a nightmare now, a nightmare forever. While the doctors saw the top of Superman's head off and begin stitching up the boo-boo on his brain, Sandy Superman swoops in to fight the War Demon, having apparently absorbed Superman's heroic impulses as well as his powers this time. Superman comes out of surgery, and not long after, the War Demon shows up at the hospital. When the War Demon grabs Superman, Superman wakes up and feels his strength returning. Now he is somehow absorbing power from the demon. Sandy Superman arrives, and together they are able to beat the War Demon back to the park and force the being that possessed it back through the rift into the realm of Quarm. The War Demon collapses to the ground, once again a lifeless object. Sandy Supes turns to Superman like, "Hey, great, we win. Now let's fight." Superman's like, "Why?" And Sandy Superman says, "Because I like being a hero now. I want to be Superman, but I can't be Superman while you're still Superman, so one of us has to die." Just then, I-Ching shows up and says, "Hang on, let me do a magic spell on you first to cancel out your opposite energies so you can touch each other without triggering massive explosions." Okay, there. The two Supermans fight. They fight on the ground. They tunnel straight through the center of the Earth and come out fighting on the other side. They fly out into space and fight. And as they fight, a global disaster occurs on Earth, caused by their tearing through the center of the planet. Earthquakes shake the planet. The crust cracks. Molten rock spews forth. Cities are toppled. The atmosphere fills with smoke. And within a matter of minutes, every single person on the planet is dead, 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 dead. Superman's like, "Oh, dude, look, we were so caught up in our selfish conflict, we didn't even notice we were wiping out all life on Earth. This sucks." Then I-Ching's like, "Wake up, dum-dum, none of that actually happened." Superman's like, "Our fight was just a dream?" I-Ching says, "Yeah, I put you both into a trance and showed you a vision of what could be the result if you did fight each other. Hopefully, now you realize the folly of your feud with one another." They do realize it. They realize it so much that Sandy Superman declares that he will voluntarily return to his home dimension of Quarm. Before he goes, I-Ching says, "Wait, I can transfer the superpowers you took back to Superman so he can be at full strength again." But Superman himself says, "No, don't do that. I'm actually super enough how I am right now." Sandy Superman's like, "Okay, suit yourself, bye," and disappears through the rift back to the realm of Quarm. The rift closes, and I-Ching turns to Superman like, "So what now?" And Superman's like, "How about you get the fuck away from me?" And then Superman just stands there alone in the dark like a weirdo. I guess maybe Sandy Superman rubbed off on him a little, huh? Not surprising given, made of sand. Anyway, as an attempt to retool Superman for a new era, and as a story unto itself, the Sandman Saga is at best a qualified success. Some of the changes Denny O'Neil introduced didn't last very long. His most significant change, reducing Superman's power level, was reversed almost immediately. O'Neil felt it was important to have a less powerful Superman in order to make it easier to place Superman in jeopardy. A lot of people, including DC Comics readers, didn't see it that way, and the depowered Superman concept was dropped. The very next issue of the monthly Superman comic following the end of the Sandman Saga has Superman shrugging off the effects of a supernova on the first page, then later casually flying fast enough to travel through time. So, literally a month later, it was like the power down, which was one of O'Neil's primary goals in writing the Super Sandman storyline, had never happened. Other changes to Superman and his world lasted a bit longer than that. Kryptonite stayed gone for at least a few years, though by the late 70s, Superman writers had started to reintroduce it, first in the form of synthetic kryptonite, then finally by establishing that more kryptonite had fallen to Earth from outer space in the years since all the kryptonite that was already here turned to iron. Even after green kryptonite was reintroduced, the other colors of kryptonite that had been regularly featured in Superman stories throughout the Silver Age remained mostly gone, though they did still pop up on rare occasions. The most enduring of O'Neill's changes turned out to be Clark Kent TV reporter. Clark remained exclusively a TV reporter for pretty much the rest of the 70s. He became the anchor of his own newscast, even. In 1979, he returned to the Daily Planet, but from that point on, he worked as both a TV and a newspaper reporter. How did he have the time and the energy to be both a newspaper reporter and a TV reporter / anchorman, while he was also constantly saving the world as Superman? If that's the point at which your suspension of disbelief gives out. Despite some of O'Neill's most obvious changes being reversed either immediately or within a few years, one more general change that did stick was the more serious tone. As exemplified by the Superman in Hell story in issue number 236, that more serious tone was very much a relative concept. The Superman stories of the 1970s still read as pretty goofy when judged by our modern sensibilities, but compared to the Silver Age silliness that filled the pages of that same series just a few years before, the change is noticeable. Superman's roster of look-alike robots was phased out. Lois Lane became far less preoccupied with proving that Clark Kent and Superman were the same person, and Superman dropped his nasty Silver Age habit of protecting his secret identity from Lois through extravagant and often mean-spirited gaslighting schemes. As a story, the Sandman Saga is a similarly mixed bag. The artwork is fantastic, which should go without saying given that the penciler for the entire project is Curt Swan, the definitive Superman artist, arguably, though if you're saying it's someone else, I would need to hear the argument. Swan's character rendering and storytelling are sharp as ever here, but another thing the Sandman Saga reminds me of is how well Swan adapted his style to the changing times. He was one of the most prolific and influential Superman artists of the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. His work in the 1950s and early to mid-60s exemplifies the classic Silver Age style. His Superman was the Superman for that time period, square-jawed with a large, boxy physique. By the early 1970s, Swan had adjusted to a more modern take. His Superman was leaner, more realistically proportioned, with a softer jawline that brought out the humanity and kindness of the character, and his page layouts were more varied and dynamic. It's a credit to Swan's talent and versatility that when Julius Schwartz decided it was time to bring Superman out of the Silver Age, he brought in a new writer, but had no qualms keeping the same artist. While the artwork is thoroughly outstanding, the writing has its ups and downs. It's just as well that O'Neill's reduction in Superman's power level didn't last, because it's the most problematic aspect of the Sandman Saga. It's not that it's a bad idea. I've said before in this series, I like a relatively low-powered Superman. He doesn't need to be able to juggle planets or fly fast enough to time travel. If he can fly, if bullets bounce off of him, and if he's strong enough to stop an airplane from crashing, then he's plenty super for me. But there are times reading through the Sandman Saga where it feels like the entire 9-issue storyline has been one long, overly complicated contrivance to justify dialing down Superman's superpowers. Denny, if that's what you want to do, just do it, man. Does it really need to take almost a year's worth of comics to accomplish? How contrived is the sequence of events that leads to Superman winding up with a decreased power level by the end of the storyline? Let me remind you of the major points. The Kryptonite engine explosion creates Superman's sand-based duplicate. And for the first few issues, every time Superman is close to Sandy Superman, he loses a bit more of his power until eventually he's unable to fly and his super strength is significantly weakened. After keeping his distance from Sandy Superman for a bit, he slowly begins to regain some power, but then he fails to stop that building from toppling and the public becomes aware of his diminished abilities. Then I-Ching shows up and restores him to full power by taking back the power stolen by Sandy Supes, but Superman has brain damage when he is restored to full power and behaves erratically, so Sandy Supes has to drain him again so they can do brain surgery. Then he absorbs power back from the War Demon. Then after the War Demon is defeated, Supes and Sandy Supes decide not to fight each other, and Supes declines I-Ching's offer to restore him to full power before Sandy Supes returns to his home dimension. Even spread out across 9 issues, that's a lot. O'Neill is so preoccupied with powering down Superman that there's almost no room for Lois or Jimmy or anyone else in the regular supporting cast to do anything. There's that one issue where Superman briefly leaves Earth to avoid spreading the disease that turns people into lumpy green monsters, which ends with Superman rescuing Lois from the combined threat of bandits and killer ants. And there's Jimmy Olsen popping in near the end of the saga to get a beaten and depowered Superman to the hospital. But that's really all Superman's girlfriend and Superman's pal have to do of note in the entire storyline. There's also O'Neill's peculiar tendency to have Earth get almost blown up by small bombs. It only happens twice in this run, but 2 issues out of 9 featuring a scene where Superman has to prevent the entire planet Earth from being destroyed by a modestly sized bomb feels excessive. At the very least, it's repetitive. Swan even draws the 2 bombs very similarly, though I guess there are only so many ways you can draw a bomb. Those are some of the negatives, but there are positives in the writing here as well. I enjoy the fact that even though the stories that make up the Sandman Saga are all pretty outlandish, beings from other dimensions, magical, ability-stealing harps, etc., the action is mostly confined to Metropolis. I say mostly, there is the Superman in Hell story, which seems to take place in the afterlife at first, and then turns out to be taking place on a rogue planet, and there are other sequences in other issues of the run that take Superman to other parts of the world or to outer space, but the majority of the saga's events occur close to home. I have nothing against the more cosmic side of Superman. There's fun to be had by showing him traveling the galaxy, visiting other planets, and mixing it up with aliens, but I don't know, maybe it's because the versions of Superman I imprinted on the strongest as a kid were from TV and the movies, where his exploits were decidedly terrestrial in nature. I just prefer a more earthbound Superman. If the Blue Fairy came through the window one night and granted my wish to write a monthly Superman comic, I'd want it to be Superman Metropolis, where every story took place in, you guessed it, Metropolis. Other creators could take him across the universe. I'd be writing new episodes of The Adventures of Superman. Like I said before, there's nothing wrong with the idea of making Superman less powerful. In its best moments, the Sandman Saga demonstrates that it's not Superman's strength or speed or ability to fly that make him a hero. It's his selflessness, his courage, and his determination to help others. Even during the sections of the story where his powers are at their lowest, he never shrinks from his responsibilities as a hero. He hesitates only once, after he fails to stop the building from falling over and is mocked for it by people on the street. He's wallowing in self-pity when he hears about the ongoing bank robbery nearby. For a moment, he thinks to himself, well, it's no concern of mine. The smug citizens can solve their own problems. But the very next panel, he thinks better of it. I can't change my whole personality, my very identity, he tells himself. I've got to be what I am. In this scene and elsewhere in the Sandman Saga, O'Neill makes a clumsy but earnest attempt to humanize Superman, to let us see him struggling with insecurities and anxieties that comic readers of the era were not accustomed to seeing Superman have to deal with. At times, this Superman reads more like a Marvel character than a DC character. In his brief bout of self-pity following the building collapse, in his attempts to conceal his diminishing powers from others, and in his worrying over how to juggle his new job as a TV reporter with his superhero activities, he reminds me a lot of Spider-Man. That's not a bad thing, but it's definitely a different color on Superman, especially in the early 70s. The Sandman Saga is largely a footnote in Superman's history today. Some of the changes it introduced, like Clark Kent going to work for WGBS and the eradication of Kryptonite, turned out to be semi-permanent, but even they were still largely reversed by the mid-1980s, which means that people my age missed them completely the first time around. As an attempt to modernize Superman, it was less ambitious and less successful than John Byrne's Man of Steel miniseries was 15 years later, and honestly, judged on its own merits, it's very uneven, and works as well as it does mostly on the strength of Curt Swan's artwork. And yet, I still find it worth remembering. Though not as dramatic a turning point as the introduction of the post-crisis Superman in 1986, it is still a turning point, marking Superman's transition from the Silver to the Bronze Age. It is the product of a recognition by those who held the creative reins of the character that Superman needed to grow and evolve with the times. Creative evolution, like its natural counterpart, is not always simple and rarely, if ever, yields perfection, but it is still necessary and something to appreciate. Denny O'Neil's attempt to scale back Superman's superpowers was poorly received and quickly discarded, and the story he told in order to get to that point is clunky and messy and meandering, but as I wandered through its pages recently, I could see that, despite its flaws, it was the work of a writer who fundamentally understood who Superman was and is and must always be. In the Sandman Saga, when Superman finds himself unable to fly to the rescue, he leaps. When he can no longer leap, he runs. When the bullets bouncing off his chest start to hurt, he still chooses to place himself between those bullets and their intended targets. He frets, he falters, but he doesn't quit. And he ends the story weaker in body, but still strong in spirit, having realized that the muscles don't make the man, and they definitely don't make the best Superman ever.